I was 18 years old the day three widows bought me together. People in that town still talk about it like it was some kind of scandalous joke. Three black-clad ladies, one young man on the block. A price nobody sane would pay. They say what they made me do killed two of them. They're not entirely wrong, but the thing they never understood is this. In a place built on slavery, it's never just one act that kills anyone. It's years of small bargains, quiet lies, and numbers written in ink that might as well be blood. I grew up in a port city on the southern coast, the kind with ships always coming and going and the smell of salt living in every board and brick. I won't give you the name. If you know enough history, you can guess. If you don't, the name won't help you. My name was Elijah then, just Elijah, no last name that anyone wrote down. The morning they sold me, the sky was clear and hard. The way it gets after a storm has scrubbed everything clean. Men with money leaned against fence rails and joked with each other like they were at a horse sale. Traders checked teeth, backs, hands. Babies cried. Somebody's mother prayed under her breath until a driver told her to shut up, or he'd give her something to cry for. I'd been brought down from a plantation inland after the master died, with debts on every side. His nephews didn't want to bother with book-learned boys. That was the phrase they used. The overseer told me I should be grateful I wasn't going to the fields. Maybe some rich lady needs a house pet, he said, laughing to himself. I had a worn coat, a Bible I wasn't allowed to keep, and a head full of numbers and letters my first master had made me learn so I could copy ledgers. I watched him work with merchants and factors, seeing the way ink on paper could move more money than 10 wagons loaded with cotton. I'd thought that knowledge might save me somehow. When they put me up, the trader read off the usual, 18, strong, knows his letters. I could feel every eye measuring me, weighing cost against usefulness, cruelty against boredom. Then I saw them. 3 women, standing a little apart from the main cluster of buyers. All were dressed in black, but not all in the same way. The tallest, with iron gray hair pulled into a tight knot, wore mourning like armor, back straight, gloves buttoned, eyes sharp as pins. Beside her stood a softer figure, round-faced, with a veil that trembled because her hands wouldn't stay still. On the fan, she twisted. The youngest of the 3, though she was still older than my mama would have been if she'd lived, had the kind of face that looked like it smiled easily once, before grief moved in to stay. They looked out of place there, not because they were women. White women came to auction sometimes, but because they were together. Widows usually kept their distance from one another, careful about how grief and money were seen to mix. Lot 23, the trader said. One Elijah, who'll start at 300. A planter in a mud-stained coat raised his hand. 350, a voice called. It took me a second to realize it came from the gray-haired widow. The trader's eyebrows flicked up. 350 from Mrs. Price. Do I hear 4? 4, said another man. 5, said the same woman. There was a little ripple of amusement through the crowd. Widows weren't supposed to bid hard unless they were desperate or foolish. The trader cleared his throat. 5. Do I hear 550? 550, said the youngest widow quietly. It went like that, back and forth. Men dropped out. They started shaking their heads, muttering about silly women and wasted money. The widows didn't seem to hear them. They didn't even look at each other. They just took turns speaking numbers like they'd agreed on the pattern beforehand. 700. 8. 9. 1,000. By the time the trader's voice cracked over 1,100, there was no one else left bidding. He stared at them like he couldn't decide whether to be pleased or worried. Going once. Going twice. 1,200, the trembling one said suddenly, her voice catching on the last word. The trader smacked his cane on the block. Sold. To the ladies. People laughed then. Someone near the fence said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Well now, that boy had better come with 3 of himself for that price. I was shaking inside, though I didn't show it. Men who paid too much for a person usually made sure they sweated every dollar out of them. They brought me down off the block and into the shade where the widows waited. Up close, I could see more. The iron-haired one had lines cut deep from nose to mouth, not the kind made by smiling. Her eyes were a cold, careful gray. Lydia Price, I would learn later. Her husband had owned warehouses along the docks before he drank himself into a coffin. The trembling widow with the veil had soft, anxious eyes and a little gold cross at her throat. Mrs. Abigail Kent, whose husband had been a minister with a taste for risk and bad loans. The youngest, with the almost smile that wouldn't quite come back, had freckles across her nose that the sun couldn't scare off. Joanna Finch, daughter of a man who'd owned 3 ships and a small plantation and left her with both responsibilities and enemies. They looked me over without touching me, which was already different. "Can you read, Elijah?" Mrs. Price asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said. My voice sounded rough to my own ears. "Numbers 2? "Yes, ma'am." She nodded, like she already knew the answer and just wanted to hear me say it. "Have you kept books before?" "Yes, ma'am, for the gin house, and for the master's accounts sometimes." "Good," she said. "You'll be more use than most men in this yard." Mrs. Kent flinched a little at that, like the way she said it scraped across some part of her conscience. Joanna Finch stepped closer. "Do you understand what's happened today?" she asked. Her voice was low, but it carried. I almost laughed. "I've been sold, ma'am." She shook her head slightly. "You have been shared," she said, "between the 3 of us. You belong to all of us now." I knew enough law to understand how wrong that sounded. People got divided like that in wills, but not at the moment of sale. But the trader had written something, and money had changed hands, and nobody had stopped them. "Yes, ma'am," I said, because what else could I say? They took me not to a plantation, not to the big houses they each owned across town, but to a plain brick building near the docks. It was tall and narrow, with iron balconies and shutters that stayed mostly closed. From the street, it looked like the kind of place that stored cotton bales or dry goods. From the inside, it looked like an office someone had tried to turn into a home and given up halfway. They brought me up 2 flights of stairs to a room with a narrow bed, a small desk, and a single window that looked down on an alley. There was a basin, a chair, and a shelf with a few books on it. The floorboards were worn, but swept. "This will be your room," Mrs. Price said. "You will not be housed with the field hands. You will not be in any one of our homes more than the others. You stay here unless you are sent for. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Abigail," she said, turning to Mrs. Kent, "will you explain the rest?" Mrs. Kent swallowed, fingers twisting in her handkerchief. "We are in a difficult position, Elijah," she began. "Our husbands left us with property and obligations, but also with debts. There are men in this town who would prefer we fail. They are watching us, waiting for us to falter, so they can take what is left." "They expect us to sell off land and people," Mrs. Price cut in, "to break apart families, to hand over everything our husbands ever worked for. They expect us to hand them the ledger of our lives and let them erase and rewrite at their convenience." Joanna's jaw tightened. "We refuse," she said simply. I didn't say anything. Nobody asked whether we, the ones counted as property, refused. Mrs. Price looked at me hard. "We bought you because you can read and keep accounts. You will carry messages between our houses. You will manage ledgers that must be exact in one column and creative in another. You will help us keep what the law says is ours." "If you do what we ask," Joanna said, "you will live better here than you would in most places. You will eat well. You will not be beaten for sport. You will have books. If you betray us," Mrs. Price finished, "there are laws in this state that would hang you and ruin us. Do you understand the weight of that?" I understood the weight of rope. I had seen men hanging from trees like broken promises. I understood the way numbers on a page could be used to justify every cruelty. I didn't yet understand where the line fell between survival and betrayal. That would come later. Yes, ma'am, I said again. They left me there in that narrow room, with the smell of the sea drifting in through the shutters and the sound of wagon wheels below. I sat on the bed, looked at the books, and realized my life had just been tied to 3 white women who were desperate enough to break rules other people hadn't even thought about. What they needed from me wasn't muscle. It was something more dangerous. The work began slowly, like a fever that doesn't show itself until it's almost too late. In the mornings, a boy from the Price house would come with a basket and a folded note. The note would tell me which widow to attend that day, what to bring, where to go. I wore plain clothes, not livery, so in the street I looked like any errand boy. At Mrs. Price's, I sat at a tall desk in her late husband's office, copying figures from one ledger into another. The first book showed the truth: how many bales shipped, how many barrels stored, which merchants owed money, which ones didn't. The second book showed the version she wanted creditors to see, smoothing out the worst of the trouble. "You must never get those confused," she said once, tapping the 2 leather spines with a finger. "The left keeps us honest with ourselves. The right keeps us safe from everyone else." At Mrs. Kent's, I wrote letters in a fine slanted hand at her dictation. Gentle pleading words to church boards and northern relatives, asking for advance support and grace in repayment, never saying outright how close the wolves were. When she grew tired, I read scripture to her in the parlor while she nodded. Eyes closed, lips moving on silent prayers, I wasn't invited to join. At Joanna Finch's house, which sat a little way out of town, I walked the edges of her fields, noting which rows had gone to weed, which cabins leaned too far, which tools were broken. In the evenings, she spread maps on her dining table and had me mark down where her father's remaining ships traveled, which ports still extended credit, which captains could be trusted. "It was never supposed to be my job to know all this," she said once, more to herself than to me. "But the men who were supposed to know are in the ground. So here we are." She poured herself a little whiskey and poured me a glass of water. I stood, she sat. That was how it always was. As weeks turned into months, I saw more than any one slave was usually allowed to see. I saw white men lean too close to white widows at church doors, lowering their voices as they offered help. I saw the way Mrs. Kent's hand shook when a certain banker's name was mentioned. I watched Mrs. Price look over contracts with the concentration of an officer studying battle plans. I also saw the people whose names took up whole pages in those ledgers for assets. Field hands bending under sacks of rice, housemaids waking before dawn, boys with bare feet and sharp eyes. I slept in a narrow bed alone, but my dreams were full of crowded cabins and the wails I'd heard too many times on auction days. If you ask me when things turned from desperate to dangerous, I can point to a particular evening in late summer. We were at Mrs. Price's office, the air thick with heat and ink. She had summoned the other 2 widows and a man named Harrow, who wore his wealth like another layer of skin. Ring on every finger, watch chain gleaming, boots polished too bright for honest work. Harrow laid his hat on the desk and smiled without showing his teeth. "Ladies," he said, "you know why we're here. Interest accrues. Notes come due. The world does not stand still out of respect for your grief." Mrs. Kent's lips tightened. Joanna stared at a spot on the wall. "You have land, of course," Harrow went on, "but the market is flooded. Every man with more acres than sense is trying to sell. Land is worth far less than the paper it's written on at the moment." "We're aware," Mrs. Price said coolly. You also have people, he said, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. Skilled ones, too. I've seen them on your properties. Carpenters, seamstresses, healthy young men and women. Those always bring good prices. Mrs. Kent flinched. Joanna's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles jump. I can arrange a discreet sale, Harrow continued. No need for public auctions. No need for your names to be attached. 10, 15, maybe 20 souls spread among you three. And we can tidy up these accounts in a way that preserves your positions. Or you can watch the sheriff nail notices to your doors in a few months' time. Your choice. Mrs. Price's face didn't change, but I saw a muscle move in her cheek. You're suggesting we break apart families that have worked our land for generations, she said. Do you think we don't understand the cost of that? Harrow shrugged. Better you sell them than have them seized in a public sale. The law doesn't wring its hands over feelings, Mrs. Price. It cares about property and debt. He glanced at me then, standing by the window with a ledger against my chest. For a moment his gaze sharpened, curious why I was in the room at all. Mrs. Price followed his eyes. Elijah is my clerk, she said. He writes what we tell him, nothing more. Well, Harrow said, standing, then have your clerk prepare lists. 20 heads between you. Choose the ones you can spare. I'll be back in a week. After he left, the room felt smaller. Mosses! Kent sank into a chair. 20, she whispered. How are we supposed to decide? By need, Mrs. Price said, voice tight. Old ones. Sick ones. Those who cost more than they bring in. Children? Joanna's voice was sharp, disbelieving. Children are harder to place, Mrs. Price said. They don't command prices to match the trouble they bring. The trouble they bring, Joanna repeated slowly, like every syllable hurt. Do you hear yourself, Lydia? What would you have me say? Mrs. Price snapped. That it doesn't tear me apart? That I don't see their faces when I try to sleep? I am telling you the arithmetic as the men down at the counting house understand it. We can either choose, or the sheriff will choose for us, and he won't be gentle about it. Mrs. Kent looked at me suddenly, as if she'd just remembered I was there. Go back to your room, Elijah, she said, voice shaking. We'll send for you when we need you. I obeyed, but the words followed me down the stairs, into the alley, back to my narrow bed. Make lists. Choose the ones you can spare. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rats in the walls and the distant creak of ships rocking in their berths. What they were asking wasn't just numbers in a column. They wanted me to put names down on paper. Names of people I knew. People who had passed me bread at kitchen doors. People whose children played marbles in the dust. Names that would become tags tied to wrists. Notes pinned to shirts as they were marched away. They wanted me to decide whose life was worth what. In the dark, I heard voices from other nights. My mother, before they sold her, telling me, "Don't let them teach you to think the way they do." My first master, chuckling as he tapped a ledger. Numbers don't lie, boy. That's what makes them useful. Both of them were wrong sometimes. That night, numbers felt like the worst lie of all. The next day, notes came from all three houses, just as Harrow had ordered. Mrs. Price's was a single line. Come, bring fresh ledger. Mrs. Kent's was blotched, as if her hand had trembled so hard she'd dropped ink. Joanna's had only 2 words. I'm sorry. They met in Mrs. Price's office again, tight-lipped and pale. I sat at the desk with a blank page open and a quill in my hand. We'll each give you some names, Mrs. Price said. You'll write them in a neat list with ages and skills beside them. No mistakes. Mrs. Kent whispered, God forgive us, and pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Joanna stood by the window, fists clenched. Mrs. Price began speaking names. Some were old folks bent with years. Some were people I'd seen limping through the yards, bad leg or bad lungs. When she got to a woman named Ruth, with a crooked back, who still made the best bread I'd ever tasted, I paused. Is there a problem? Mrs. Price asked. I thought Mrs. Price liked Ruth's bread, I said before I could stop myself. Her eyes flashed. I do, but Harrow will like the price she brings even more. Right, I wrote. Mrs. Kent's list came out haltingly, like every syllable cut her tongue. She named a boy whose only crime was being shy and slow to answer. A girl who sang while she worked and had once slipped me a sweet potato behind the smokehouse. Mrs. Kent, I began, but she shook her head, tears standing in her eyes. If I don't give some names, she whispered, he'll take them all. Then it was Joanna's turn. She opened her mouth, closed it again, swallowed. You know them, she said finally, looking at me instead of the other women. You walk my land. You see who's strong, who's not. You choose for mine, Elijah. There it was, the thing that would haunt me for the rest of my life. She put the choosing on me. Mrs. Price frowned. Joanna? No, Joanna said sharply. If I pick, I'll pick wrong. I'll pick the ones whose faces I can bear to forget, and I'll damn myself forever. Let him choose the ones he thinks have a chance. One way or the other. He knows more about living on the edge of a whip than we ever will. They all looked at me then. 3 pairs of white eyes on one black face, waiting to see how I would divide up human lives like coins. My hand shook. I put the pen down, flexed my fingers, picked it up again. In my head, a door opened onto a path I hadn't known existed until that moment. It was narrow and crooked and full of thorns, but it did not lead straight to the block. May I think on it overnight, ma'am? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Mrs. Price hesitated, then nodded. Harrow comes in 3 days. Do not delay longer than that. I went back to my room like a man walking on a pond he knows is freezing thin. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought about every face on Finchland. Children chasing chickens. Old men sitting on upturned buckets, telling stories. Women with scarred hands and quick eyes. I also thought about others. The overseer at Finch's place, a white man named Dugan, whose whip had found my back once when I stumbled under a bundle of reeds. The driver at Kent's, a black man who had learned to survive by becoming the master's right hand, delivering cuffs with a little too much satisfaction. Men who had long ago chosen their safety over everyone else's. They were on no one's list but mine. By dawn, I had made my choice. I went to Finch House as soon as there was light in the sky. Joanna was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. The cook moved around her in weary circles. Ruth, Joanna said, looking up as I came in, go on and check the hen house. I need a word with Elijah. Ruth wiped her hands and slipped outside. Her back was bent, but her ears were sharp. There were some things Joanna didn't want her to hear. Well? Joanna asked when we were alone. I can't do what you asked me, I said. Anger flashed in her eyes, then died as fast as it had come, leaving something worse. Resignation. You refuse, she said hollowly. I suppose I can't blame you. No one should be made to— I didn't say I refuse, I interrupted. I said I can't do it the way you think. She frowned. Explain. You want me to pick people and hand them over to Harrow, I said. To be sold God knows where. To have their names written on a bill of sale and carried away like sacks of cotton. I took a breath. I can't. Not like that. Then what can you do? She demanded. I can still make a list, I said, but it won't be a list for Harrow. She stared at me, understanding dawning slowly. Elijah, she said carefully, you know what happens to slaves who run. You know what happens to anyone who helps them. Yes, ma'am, I said, I do. Silence stretched between us. Outside, a rooster crowed, oblivious. How many? She asked at last. From your place? I said. 4, if they're careful. Maybe 6 if the others don't talk. And from mine? A voice said from the doorway. We both turned. Mrs. Kent stood there, veil up, eyes huge. I hadn't heard her come in. She must have left her carriage at the road and walked up the drive. Abigail, Joanna began. I couldn't sleep, Mrs. Kent said. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them lined up like— Her voice broke. So, I came to see if you had thought of something. And now I see you have. She looked at me. Really looked. The way she had never allowed herself to before. You would risk your life for this, she whispered. For people you don't even know well? I know them well enough, I said. I know what it feels like to hear your name called and have no say in where your feet will be forced to walk. I know what it's like to watch your mother's hands empty as they take her away. If there's even a crack in this wall big enough for one person to slip through, I can't pretend I don't see it. How? Joanna asked, voice hoarse. You make it sound like it's just a matter of paper and ink, but it's not. There are patrols, dogs, men like Harrow who live for the hunt. I know, I said. I also know Harrow expects a list in your handwriting, with 20 names total between you three. He expects to come in here, collect that paper, and walk away with your choices folded in his pocket. I tapped the ledger I'd brought with me. He doesn't know the names yet. Only that he'll get some. We can use that. We talked then in low voices, with the kitchen door barred and the cook kept away on errands. I laid out what had come to me in the long hours between midnight and dawn. We would still write a list, 20 names like Harrow demanded. But some of those names would be men who weren't what they seemed. There was Caleb, a blacksmith's apprentice on Priceland, whose sister had been sold last year and who had quietly sworn never to let his youngest brother be taken. There was Josiah, the driver at Kent's, who had started slipping food to runaways in the woods instead of whipping them back to the fields. At Finch's, there was Ruth's niece, a girl with quick hands and a quicker mind, who had once looked at me and said, "If I ever get out of here, I'm never coming back." I had been listening for people like that without even meaning to. Now I wrote their names in one column of my mind, and Harrow's in another. We won't send them to him, I said. We'll make it look like we did. We'll create ghosts on paper. They'll vanish from your books here and appear in his imagination somewhere else. Meanwhile, the real flesh and blood... I stopped because the word free wouldn't quite come. They can go. Go where? Mrs. Kent asked. North, I said. Into the swamps first, then follow the river. There are people who help, I've heard. A line of safe houses, quilts on fences, lamps in certain windows. How do you know this? Joanna said sharply. I hesitated. Slaves talk, ma'am. Even when we look like we're just moving your chairs or holding your reins, we hear things. Mrs. Kent paced, skirts swishing. If Harrow finds out, I said quietly, I'll already be dead. You probably will be too. But if he doesn't, you keep your land a little longer, and some of your people get a chance they'd never have otherwise. The ones left behind will be watched more closely, yes, but they'll also have hope. Sometimes that's a sharper tool than any blade. Joanna stared at the table, fingers drumming. You'd be the one to tell them, she said, to put this madness in their ears. Yes, and when they run, and the patrols ride, and men like Harrow get hungry for blood, you think they won't tear this town apart looking for someone to blame. Oh, they will, I said. They'll blame everyone and no one. They'll beat men who never thought of running. They'll threaten you. They might even turn on each other trying to find where the leak came from. I met her eyes. But if we do nothing, the beating just happens on a different day, in a different place, with no chance on the far side of it. At least this way, some of those beatings might miss their mark. Mrs. Kent sank back into the chair. We are talking about deceiving a man who holds our lives in his hands, she whispered. We are talking about helping slaves run. I can't even say the words without feeling like the ground will open under me. You are also talking, I said gently, about not selling children like furniture. Her head jerked up. She pressed the handkerchief to her mouth hard enough to leave a red mark. God forgive me, she said. God forgive us all. In the end, it was not courage that made them agree. It was something smaller and stranger, the knowledge that they were already drowning. and this might be a way to at least pull someone else onto a piece of driftwood. Do it, Joanna said finally. Write your list. Tell them what you need to tell them. If we are damned, let it be for something besides cowardice. When I left Finch House that afternoon, I carried more than a ledger. I carried a plan. The next 2 days moved like a fever dream. I went from cabin to cabin under cover of routine errands, speaking without moving my lips much, tilting my head just so the wrong ears wouldn't catch the right words. I told Caleb about a path by the river where the mud stayed firm even after rain. I told Josiah about a church 3 days walk away, where a bell ringing twice at midnight meant someone would open the back door no matter who knocked. To each one I said, you don't have to go, but if you don't, your name will end up on a different kind of list. They all understood. Meanwhile, on paper, I wrote out 20 names. 8 of them belonged to people we never intended to sell. Ruth's name stayed off the page. The shy boy from Kent's stayed off. Some of the old folks stayed off too, because even in their fear, the widows couldn't bring themselves to sign away the last years of those lives to God knows where. We filled the empty spaces with men like Dugan the Overseer, whose cruelty had earned him more enemies than friends, and a supervisor at the warehouse who had been quietly skimming off the top of the widow's shipments. Harrow wouldn't complain about getting those men. He might even think he'd pulled one over on the ladies, convincing them to give up such valuable white employees along with the black ones. The night before Harrow was due to come, the sky clouded over. Heat lightning flickered on the horizon. Patrols rode their usual routes, lazily, reins loose, sure that fear and habit would keep everyone in place. In the cabins, bags were quietly packed, bread wrapped in cloth, a scrap of salt pork, a tiny Bible, a rag doll. I moved among them like a ghost, doing what they had asked me to do. Just before midnight, I stood in the shadow of the alley by my room and looked up at a thin slice of moon. My hands were shaking so badly I pressed them against the bricks to steady them. If you're expecting me to say I was brave, I won't. I was terrified. My body knew what my mind kept trying to ignore. If this went wrong, there would be no mercy. I heard the first soft whistles, the ones we'd agreed on. One from the direction of Finchland, another from Kent's, a third from Price's warehouses. They moved like shadows, 5, 10, then more, slipping from behind sheds and between hedges. They didn't move as a group. That would be too easy to spot. They drifted, 1 and 2 and 3 at a time, toward the back road that led to the river. From where I stood, I could see maybe a dozen figures at once, never close enough together to look like an army, always close enough to share courage if their eyes met in the dark. I wasn't going with them. That had been part of the deal from the beginning. You're already too visible, Joanna had said. If you vanish, Harrow will know at once where to look. We need you to stay where they can see you, at least for a while. I had nodded, though every part of me longed to feel the road under my feet and the air of some other place in my lungs. So I stayed. It might have worked. Even now, all these years later, I believe that. The patrols were sloppy the night thick. They'd have reached the river, met the contact Josiah thought he had waiting, and the story would have gone a different way. But there's always someone who notices. This time, it was a boy who worked in Harrow's stables. He was the kind of boy who liked to be near power, the kind who laughed when the masters laughed and made fun of anyone weaker than him. He had gone out to relieve himself behind the barn and seen a figure darting along the fence that wasn't supposed to be there. He followed. He watched. When he realized what was happening, he ran, breathless, to bang on Harrow's door. Within half an hour, there were riders in the street, torches, dogs. I heard the shouts before I saw the flames. "Patrol! To the road! Runners! This way! Wake up! Wake up!" From my window, I saw lanterns bobbing like angry fireflies along the back lanes. I saw a woman stumble, a child pulled back by a hand clutching his collar. I heard a shot, a high cry cut off. I couldn't see which bodies hit the ground. I thank God for that even now. But I saw something else too. From Finch House came a sudden flare of orange, not from the back where the cabins were, but from the front parlor. Within minutes, the whole lower floor was lit from inside like a lantern. Fire. Later, I would learn how it started. Ruth told me in broken snatches, weeks after everything was over. One of the runaways, Caleb, I think, had swung through the kitchen to hug his little brother one last time. He knocked over a lantern. The flame licked up, an apron hung on a nail, and then took to the curtains like they'd been waiting for it. Ruth had tried to smother it. Someone else had tried too. The patrols outside saw the flicker and hesitated, thinking maybe the house itself was under attack. In the confusion, some of the runners got farther than they would have otherwise. Inside, chaos. Joanna, woken by shouting, ran toward the stairs. Smoke poured down like a black waterfall. Someone yelled at her to stay out, that they'd get the children, but she pushed past. She went up the steps and into heat thick enough to bake bread in. She didn't come back down. They found her later in the hall by the nursery, one arm flung over a little girl's body. The child survived. Joanna didn't. That was one. Across town, Mrs. Kent had been woken by the same clamor, the same rush of feet. She ran to the window and saw shadows moving through her garden. Her first thought, by her own servant's account, was that the patrols had come to take everyone, not just the ones we had planned for. Without thinking, she went out on the front steps in her nightdress, calling out to them. "Stop, please, they're just children." Someone on horseback, half drunk on authority and fear, mistook her silhouette for a runaway moving where no runaway should be. He fired. The bullet caught her high in the chest. She fell backward, down 3 stone steps, and lay there with her eyes wide open, staring at a patch of stars that didn't care one way or another. That was 2. I didn't see either death with my own eyes. I heard them described later in hushed, horrified voices from people who wished they could forget. But I saw the smoke from Finch House, and I heard the crack of the shot near Kent's, and I felt something inside me break and fold in on itself. Because I knew in a way no one else did that I had put both women in the path of that night. No, I hadn't lit the lantern or pulled the trigger, but I had set the whole chain in motion. I had said yes when I could have said no. I had written names on a secret list and told people where to run. What they had made me do, choose, plan, count, had led to a night when fire and lead did the rest. Harrow came the next day to collect his list. He walked into Mrs. Price's office with smoke still hanging over the town and ash on his boots. "This is a mess," he said, not bothering to hide his irritation. 2 widows dead, half their stock scattered, patrols swearing they'll flay the next black man they see out after dark, and I still don't have what I was promised. "You have some," Mrs. Price said, voice like ice. "There are men in your custody right now who could earn you twice what you're owed. Don't pretend you came away empty-handed." He glared at her, then turned his attention to me. "And you," he said, "what did you see?" I looked down at the ledger in my hands, at the names written there in neat, even ink. Some belonged to men now hiding in swamps, hearts pounding like rabbit feet. Some belonged to men in Harrow's chains. 2 belonged to women lying still on white sheets, faces covered. "I saw smoke," I said. "I saw men shouting. I heard shots." He studied my face, searching for lies. "Did you help them run?" he asked. Behind him, Mrs. Price went rigid. It was the only slip I ever saw in her composure. I thought of what one honest word could do in that moment. It could clean the ledger in some people's minds. It could also send me swinging from a tree limb before the day was over, and drag what was left of the widows' names through a different kind of fire. "No, sir," I said quietly. I write what I'm told to write. I was in my room when it started. He stared a moment longer, then snorted. You're too bookish to be that clever, he said dismissively. If you ever get ideas, remember what you saw last night. He left without his 20 names tidy in a row. He did just fine anyway. Men like him always did, until the ground under them shifted years later in ways they never saw coming. Mrs. Price waited until the door shut, then turned on me. What did you do? She demanded. The room was empty except for us. The air felt thin. I did what you asked, I said. You told me to make lists. You told me to use my head. You told me to help you keep what the law would rip away. I did not tell you to start a revolt, she hissed. It wasn't a revolt, I said. Most of your people stayed. They always stay. They think maybe if they keep their heads down, the fire will pass over them next time. They're usually wrong. She paced to the window, then back, her skirts whispering like angry snakes. 2 women are dead, she said. Do you understand that? Yes, I said softly. I understand it every time I close my eyes. She stared at me, then at the ledger still in my hands. How many got away? She asked. The question dragged out of her like a tooth. I don't know, I said. Enough to make the patrols ride hard, not enough to empty your fields. She sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than her years. You've ruined me, she whispered. Or saved me. I can't tell which yet. She looked up sharply. As long as you're here, you're a danger. They'll keep sniffing around as long as they can put their hands on you. Harrow might even decide you're more trouble than you're worth and take matters into his own hands. So, what will you do with me? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, then at the ledger again. I'm going to sell you, she said at last. Far inland, somewhere nobody knows your face or your handwriting. If you live long enough, maybe the war that's coming will spit you back out with a different name. I must have flinched, because something like pity crossed her features. You could have stayed safe, she said tiredly. You could have done as you were told, written the names we gave you, and grown old at a desk. You might even have died free by some quirk of inheritance. Instead, I did what you made me capable of doing, I said quietly. You taught me to count all the columns, Mrs. Price, not just the ones that favored you. For a second, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she laughed once, a harsh little sound with no joy in it. You're clever, she said. Clever men don't always live long in this world. They live long enough to change something sometimes, I said. We didn't speak much after that. Within a week, I was on a wagon headed inland with a chain around my ankles and a bill of sale folded in the driver's pocket. She was right about one thing. War came. It tore through that world like the fire through Finch's parlor, sparing some things, devouring others. I won't tell you all of how I made it through. That's another story. What matters for this one is that I did live. I saw men in blue and gray kill each other over words that had sat in law books too long. I saw chains fall off wrists and then reappear in other forms. Debt, hunger, laws written to trap feet instead of ankles. Years later, when my hair had more gray in it than black, I found myself in a little schoolhouse, chalk dust on my sleeves, teaching children with bright eyes how letters fit together to make sounds, how numbers added up. Sometimes I'd see a boy with Caleb's stubborn tilt to his head, or a girl with Ruth's quick hands. I'd wonder if somewhere, far up north, the ones who ran that night had built lives that let their grandchildren sit in desks instead of on cabin floors. When the day's lessons were done and the children drifted out, I'd sit alone sometimes and think of 3 widows. Joanna Finch, who ran into a burning house for a child that wasn't hers and never came out. Abigail Kent, who stepped onto her own front steps in the middle of chaos and begged men with guns to have mercy and paid for it with her last breath. Lydia Price, who sat behind a desk and tried to keep her world from collapsing by moving numbers from one column to another, and ended up setting loose something she couldn't control. People in that town said for years that what they made the boy do killed two of them. They meant it as gossip, a story told over card games and in kitchen corners. A warning maybe about women who reached too far, or slaves who forgot their place. I carry the story differently. They made me write, and count, and think. They put a pen in my hand and showed me how the men who ran their world used it to keep power. Then they told me to use those skills to decide who lived where, who stayed, who went. What they made me do that killed two of them wasn't one night's work. It was every small step that led to that narrow road we all walked together. Me with my lists, them with their fear, the people whose names I wrote with their hope and terror knotting together in their chests. If you want a neat ending, you won't find it here. Some of the ones who ran made it, some didn't. Some of the ones left behind lived to see freedom declared on paper. Some died without ever hearing the words spoken over them. As for me, I came out alive. I taught until my hands shook too much to write. I watched other people build laws that were a little less cruel than the ones I was born under. Do I regret what I did? I regret the fire. I regret the bullet. I regret that this world was ever arranged. So, one boy's handwriting could be the difference between a child sleeping in her own bed or on a stranger's floor 1,000 miles away. But if you ask me whether I would do it differently, knowing what I know now, I can't lie to you. The night those figures slipped past my window, moving toward a river that might or might not carry them to a kinder shore, I felt something I had never felt before in all my years of being owned. I felt that for once I was not just a number in someone else's ledger. I was the one holding the pen. And that, more than anything, is what killed the world those widows were trying so hard to keep alive. Not my cleverness, not my lists, not even the fire or the gunshot, terrible as they were. The system killed them. The way it forced every soul caught in it, owner and owned, to make choices no human being should have to make. The way it turned mercy into risk and survival into sin. They made me do the counting. The country made the rules. History likes to pretend that justice and punishment move in straight lines. I know better. I lived in the curves. 3 widows bought one 18-year-old slave together. What they made him do killed 2 of them, yes, but it also helped some people walk into a darkness that, for once, was not just an ending, but the closest thing to a beginning they were ever going to get. If you want to write it down, go ahead. Just don't turn it into a simple story with heroes and villains neatly labeled. It wasn't that kind of tale when I lived it, and it still isn't now. Some truths refuse to fit in anybody's ledger.